Okay, we'd like to welcome you back from lunch, and I would like to introduce our next speaker of today. We have Jessica Sommerville, who is an associate professor at the University of Washington, and she's going to be talking to us about the development of character in early childhood.
Well, thank you for that introduction. And I've got some nifty video clips today, so hopefully that'll get us all through the post-lunch lull. So as Laura mentioned, I'm a developmental psychologist, and what I'm going to be talking about today is the building blocks of moral character. And I'm going to be focusing on very early in life, in fact, the first 2 years of life. So one of the first questions someone who is interested in the development of moral character might ask has to do with when we start looking for evidence of moral character. And to address that question, we really need to sort of take a brief look at sort of theories and ideas about moral development. So several decades ago, a couple of sort of key players in developmental psychology were very interested in moral development, Piaget and Kohlberg. Many of you, I'm sure, have heard of these people before. And their key claims were that moral development is driven by changes in moral reasoning. So children come to act morally because of changes that we see in moral reasoning. And moral behavior really relies on higher level thinking. And accordingly, they saw morality as going through a fairly protracted developmental time course. These were the folks that gave kids moral dilemmas, the dilemmas that you've probably heard about Heinz, for example, who has the dying wife, and his wife desperately needs a drug to save her life, but he can't afford it. What should Heinz do? So these researchers were not so interested in what the kids said that Heinz would do, but rather what was the reasoning that went on behind it. And what their data suggested is that children go through this sort of developmental crime course of thinking about these dilemmas in terms of rewards and punishment, then thinking about them in terms of societal conventional rules, and only really focusing on true morality or moral principles considerably later, perhaps in adolescence or so. So this process culminated in adolescence, and from this view, of course, this has consequences for testing the construct of moral character, because this view would suggest that it's not until late childhood or adolescence that we could even start beginning to ask these questions. Well, on the heels of that, though, came some subsequent research that suggested that in certain important ways, Kohlberg and Piaget might have underestimated children's knowledge and their abilities. So with respect to the judgment side of the coin, we know from some brilliant work by Elliot Turiel and his colleagues that certainly by preschool age, maybe even a little bit younger, children can distinguish the moral domain from other domains. So at this age, children can recognize the difference between moral judgments, societal conventions, and personal judgments. A 3 or 4-year-old can say, for example, it's always wrong to hit someone, you should never do that. In terms of whether you wear your hat or back forward, that's a societal convention. You know, it's a rule that we came up with, but it doesn't really matter if you violate that. And the color t-shirt you wear is a personal judgment. And then, of course, in the adult literature, there's been some recent thinking that moral reasoning doesn't, or at least doesn't always require higher level thinking, suggesting that it might be present considerably earlier than Piaget or Kohlberg thought. Now, with respect to moral behavior, there's a long-standing tradition at looking at different behaviors that children produce that have moral relevance. And one domain that's been heavily studied is pro-social behavior. And what we know from a lot of research is that engagement in pro-social behavior starts early in life, in early childhood. There are individual differences in children's pro-social behavior. And these individual differences predict later altruism and sort of more generally other-orientedness. So they're stable over time. So these new findings are raising the question of, well, maybe if we're interested in moral character and we're interested in development, maybe we can start looking in childhood. But today I want to trace that even further back, and what I want to suggest is that we might be able to look for the building blocks of moral character considerably earlier in life, within infancy. So you might ask, why is infancy a good age to start looking for building blocks of moral character? Well, we know that based on research over the past 2 decades that relied on novel and important methodologies that got at children's understanding of the world, infants' perception and understanding of the world, that infants appear to possess fairly rich knowledge about their social world, considerably more sophisticated than we once believed. So infants know a lot about people. They think about people's behavior. They reason in terms of simple mental states, precursors to theory of mind that we heard about earlier today. They also seem to be aware of some social and cultural conventions. There's some very new and exciting work coming out to suggest that infants may also make valence judgments. That means that they might evaluate stimuli along dimensions like good and bad, positive and negative. And in respect to the social realm, what people have done in these studies is they've shown babies little plays where there's a good character and a bad character, someone who's helping someone else versus someone who's hindering someone else, and shown that young infants within the first year of life will selectively affiliate with the nice person, or the person who's doing the more helpful versus hindering action. There's now good evidence to suggest that there are individual differences in capacities that underpin moral behavior, like empathy, and that those can be traced back to infancy and are stable over time. And finally, in both experimental settings and in naturalistic circumstances, you see the emergence of pro-social behavior over the first 2 years of life in terms of kids doing things like sharing their toys with peers, with parents, even with unfamiliar experimenters, as we'll hear about today. Helping other people, an experimenter drops a pen, an 18-month-old bends down to hand the experimenter the pen, comforting others who are in distress. So that gave us motivation to start to look within infancy for some of these building blocks. So what we've been doing is we've been asking sort of two types of questions. One is about moral judgments or evaluations. The other is about the more moral behavior side of things. We want to look at both sides of the coin. And in particular, we've been focusing on when and whether infants might be able to detect violations to certain social moral norms, and if they can go beyond that and actually start to act to enforce these norms. On the side of moral behavior, we're very interested in pro-social behavior, and in particularly a particular type of pro-social behavior. We're interested in pro-social behavior that involves some sort of personal cost to the infant or to the child. And the reason I think this is an important sort of thing to highlight here is that there is a lot of research that looks at pro-social behavior that tends to conflate a social response with a truly pro-social response, one that is intended to help someone else and might involve some kind of self-sacrifice. So we're really addressing three main questions in the work of the grant. The first has to do with development in terms of infants' moral judgments and their moral behavior. So when do you see these first emerge? We're looking at the very basic origins here. When do we see our earliest evidence of the emergence of these things? The other question that we're interested in with respect to development is, are these things interrelated, and are they interrelated for the beginning? Because if you're talking about something like character, you would expect some degree of coherence across things like judgments and across things like behavior. They should be interrelated. And so an interesting question is whether they are, and whether that's something you see early in development or whether that emerges over time. We want to know about individual differences as well. So traditionally, infancy has been viewed as this sort of monolithic period. Initially, people sort of thought, perhaps like people often thought non-human animals were always the same, that all infants are all the same. But as you'll see from the work that I talk about today, there seem to be some important individual differences very early in life. And we're interested in the stability of these individual differences, meaning individual differences that we see at time one, do they persist over time? Does what we see early predict something later about the infant? And then finally, we want to try to start to get at the origins of developmental change and individual differences. And perhaps unsurprisingly, we think that parents might play an important role in socialization of these types of things. So we're interested in parental values, beliefs, and attitudes around morality and prosociality, with the underlying assumption that at some level, what you might expect is that these values, attitudes, and beliefs will manifest in real-world, everyday behaviors that could be sources of information for infants. So now, when you're doing this type of research, you have to start by picking something to focus on, picking a particular content area. And so we started by focusing on a particular social moral norm that is often referred to as the principle of equality. And this is a social moral norm that governs the distributions of goods and resources. And it's one that's been heavily studied by psychologists, by people in experimental economics, by cognitive neuroscientists. There's a lot of data on this norm, so this is one of the reasons why we chose it as a good candidate. Adults, when you bring them into a lab setting and they're given resources to distribute, tend to divide these resources equally. And the interesting thing here is they'll do that even when it means acting against their own self-interest, even when it's in a relatively anonymous setting, and even when there are no direct consequences for how they distribute the resource. They will, in these same games, punish individuals who violate this norm and seek to redistribute goods accordingly. So they're sort of seeking, it seems, at some level to enact justice along this dimension. From the cognitive neuroscience literature, we know that if you put people in an fMRI while they're playing these games, you see activation of neural structures that are value related when an individual makes a fair or equal distribution of goods. And you also see regions that are associated with negative or aversive emotional states when there's an unequal allocation performed. And importantly, there's individual differences in cross-cultural variability. So this seems like a good candidate for looking at individual differences as well. And finally, there's been some research in the past several years that have started to look at these questions in children, and pretty robustly now across a series of different studies, showing that children are aware of this norm and they act according to it by 3 to 4 years of age. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to go younger, and we thought, well, what if we can take this sort of paradigm and we can come up with something that is a little bit more appropriate or friendly for younger children? So this past fall, we conducted an initial study, and we started with 12 and 15-month-old infants. Again, we were interested in the earliest emergence. So the reason that we picked these age groups is because it's typically around 14 to 15 months of age in lab settings that you see this real proliferation of prosocial behavior. And we wanted to test infants in terms of both their moral evaluations and their moral behavior. With respect to the moral evaluations, we were interested in their awareness of this norm of equality. We tested infants on 2 different tasks, and I'll tell you about the details in just a moment. But one of them was designed to just look to see whether infants recognize when this norm has been violated. So if they see someone who has resources or goods to distribute, and the person distributes them unequally, is there going to be some indication that infants think that's unusual or unexpected? The other task was designed to go one step further and say, okay, so if infants can detect this norm, is there any evidence that they're acting to enforce the norm? So in this task, what happened was the infants were given the opportunity to take away a toy from an actor who had previously distributed goods fairly or equally versus one who distributed goods unfairly or equally. And we wanted to see if they were selectively taking the toy away from the unfair actor. And then in terms of their moral behavior, we were interested in their ability to share generously. So we developed a sharing task that involved sharing a valuable toy with a stranger to see how willing infants were to do that. So let me tell you a little bit more about each of these paradigms. The way we looked at infants' ability to detect norms of equality is we used something called a violation of expectancy paradigm. And this is a paradigm that relies on infants' looking times, their attention to different types of outcomes. And it relies on a really sort of commonly held principle that's true of not only infants, but also children and adults. And that is we show enhanced attention when something unusual or unexpected or surprising happens, right? A magician pulls a rabbit out of a hat, we think that's surprising, so we look for a long time at it. So it's an implicit measure of infants' ability, in this case, to detect norms of equality. And in our paradigm, what happened was that infants watched events on a television monitor. And what you're seeing here is still screen images from the video that they saw. The video showed someone who was distributing goods to 2 recipients. So Emily up here in the first frame has a bowl of crackers. There's 2 recipients. They each push their plates towards her, and they say, please, simultaneously. Then what happens on the video is we put up this little black occluding screen. The purpose of that occluding screen is that Emily can now distribute to the 2 recipients. But what infants don't see is how much is going where. So they know that she's putting some crackers onto each of the 2 plates, but they don't know how much is going where. And then she demonstrates that she's given away all the crackers. And then what we're able to do is we're able to show infants ending to the story or outcomes. And some of these endings are consistent with a fair or equal outcome, and some of them are inconsistent with a fair outcome. The idea here is that if infants think that it's unusual for goods to be distributed unfairly, unequally, they should show enhanced attention to this outcome. They should show longer looking to this outcome over this outcome. So that's what we did. We showed the story to infants. We showed them these 2 outcomes. We also showed them some control outcomes here. Now, the purpose of these control outcomes is to make sure that there isn't some sort of underlying perceptual preference that infants have that might drive their performance in the experimental condition. And so in the control outcomes, what infants saw is they saw exactly the same physical display of crackers on the plates, but now there aren't any people here. So this doesn't have anything to do with fairness. There's no distributor. There's no recipients. The same outcomes, as you will, in terms of the numerical display of crackers. So what we want to make sure was that infants don't have some sort of pre-existing preference for one of those 2 events that might explain their looking times to the experimental outcomes. Okay, so what I'm showing you here is a graph of infants' looking times to in this case, the experimental outcomes. Here are 15-month-olds on the left, and our 12-month-olds are on your right. And what you can see from the graph is that the 15-month-olds showed enhanced attention to the unequal outcome. They look longer when one person had more than the other person. 12-month-olds, in contrast, look equally to both outcomes. So there appears to be an age-related shift between approximately 12 and 15 months of age in infants' ability to detect inequality in the context of resource distribution tasks. And this is just their looking times to the control outcomes, demonstrating that they have no pre-existing preference for either one of the two control outcomes, meaning that there's no sort of perceptual bias going on here that might be accounting for the experimental outcomes. The other thing that was important in our findings in the experimental condition that I'll just state for now and come back to in a moment is even though we got these group-level effects and differences, there was also considerable individual variability, meaning that some 15-month-olds really paid attention to the unequal outcome. Some 15-month-olds looked 3 times as long to the unequal outcome versus the equal outcome. And some infants were much closer in their looking times. And as you'll see in a moment, these individual differences have consequences for infants' moral behavior. So the next thing we wanted to know was whether infants could go beyond detecting this regularity. So someone could look at the findings that I've just presented and they could say, well, infants obviously are really good at picking up in patterns in their environment, right? Maybe they've just kind of spotted this regularity, but maybe they aren't really understanding that this is something that has a negative value to it or something that shouldn't happen. Maybe they're just saying this is something that happens infrequently without really understanding the should component of things, without really having any evaluation. So the way that we sought to get at that is by giving infants a more active task. So we'll see a little video clip, but let me sort of give you a preview of what you're going to see in this video clip. We have 2 actors here who are sitting side by side at a little table, and there's an infant sitting on mom's lap right here. She's not close enough to be able to reach the toys, but she has a really good viewer perspective on the play that's about to unfold. Now, each of the actors has 4 toys sitting in front of her. It's a little bit hard to see here. These are yellow fish. These are little blue octopus. And during the first phase of the study, what happens is they distribute the toys to themselves and the other person. And one person distributes fairly, meaning she gives herself 2, and she gives 2 to the other person. The other person is unfair, meaning she gives herself 3, and she gives the other person 1. So that's the first phase of the study, and we'll watch what that looks like.
Hi. Wow. Mine. Mine. Yours. Yours. Hi. Wow. Mine. 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 Yours. Wow.
So you can see one person is fair and one person is unfair. There is a confound that we, well, not intentionally built in, but because of pragmatic concerns, had to build into the task. So we only had, each of these experiments that we run with infants takes about 5 people to run, which, as you can imagine, is very difficult to try to coordinate. So here we only had 2 people who could act as the distributor and the recipients. So the person who is unfair actually winds up with more than the person who's fair. So that's an important confound that we're dealing with in future studies. It's just a little bit hard because it now means we need 3 people to perform this event. So the question of interest really was which of the 2 actors infants would take a toy from. So I'm going to show you, this is a different baby than the one we saw earlier, but I'm going to show you the baby making a choice here. I always forget when I see this video is that it's going to look a little bit odd to your eyes. So when we do these studies, we have to make sure that in the choice phase, what the 2 experimenters are doing is exactly the same. Because we want to be able to say it's what happened before, not what is happening when the baby makes the choice that's driving the results. So because of that, they all do things simultaneously and they use the same tone of voice. So it seems a little bit weird because that doesn't often happen in the real world, but I'll show you what that looks like.
Goodness, do you want it?
Right. So the things we do for good scientific control sometimes depart a little bit from ecological reality. So what we were looking at in this task was just a really simple choice measure, and that is which of the 2 actors the baby chose from, who did they take the toy away from. And what you can see here is that the 15-month-olds predominantly took from the unfair actor, and 12-month-olds were more randomly distributed between the different responses. So again, there seems to be a developmental transition potentially between 12 and 15 months of age. 15-month-olds are detecting the inequality, and they're selectively taking a toy from a person who was unfair previously. Now, the final task that infants took part in was a task that we developed that we call the sharing task, or the generous sharing task. And there were 2 phases to this task as well. In the first phase of the task, what we did is we presented infants with 2 options. They saw 2 toys, and we specifically tried to choose toys where we thought one would be more valuable or interesting to the infant. So that's why we have a little doctor here and a boring Lego block here. And then infants are put equidistant from the 2 toys, and we asked them to make a choice to choose one of the 2 objects. Fairly highly, infants chose, unsurprisingly, the doll over the block. But irrespective of which one they chose, we said, OK, which one did they prefer? We used their choice to define their preference. What happened in the next part of the study is that infants, after they made their choice, they were given the other toy. So now they're holding both of the toys. They're turned around, an unfamiliar experimenter that they have never seen before. They don't know who this person is from Adam. She walks into the room. She comes up to the infant. She kneels in front of them, and she says, "Can I have one?" And she looks directly in the infant's eyes. And the ambiguity there is important, because what we want to do is we want to see, first of all, does the infant share a toy? And second of all, if they do share, are they going to share generously, meaning they're sharing their preferred toy, or are they going to share more selfishly, meaning they're sharing their unpreferred toy? So we specifically did not want the experimenter to cue a particular response from the infant, so we could look at how they chose to solve the problem, so to speak. So here's infants' performance as a function of age. The blue bars represent the non-responders. Red and yellow bars represent which of the 2 toys they shared, if they did share a toy. You can see that considerably more 15-month-olds, significantly more 15-month-olds shared a toy than the 12-month-olds. At both ages, though, they were roughly split between sharing their preferred and their non-preferred toy. So in addition to just wanting to look at potential developmental changes in infants' prosocial behavior, we wanted to see if what they did on this task was in any way related to their performance on the violation of expectancy task. Now, this is a really important question because it provides a means of sort of giving us convergent validity for our looking time task. And critically, the 2 tasks are wildly different in terms of their surface features, right? In the looking time task, they're watching video events. We're recording looking time. It's about distributing crackers. In the sharing task, it's about their own behavior. It's about toys and which toy they choose to share. I'm actually going to come back to this in a moment. So first, let me tell you about how results in the sharing task linked up with their performance on the violation of expectancy paradigm. This is their attention, infants' attention to the experimental outcomes. These are babies who share their preferred toy or share generously. These are babies who share their non-preferred toy. And what we found is this effect is more strongly driven, or almost exclusively driven, by babies who shared their preferred toy versus babies who shared their non-preferred toy. Now, we look specifically at these 2 groups of infants, and we're less interested in the babies that didn't share at all, because for the babies who didn't share at all, they seem to be more of a heterogeneous group. Some of the babies seem like they weren't sharing because they would just want to hold on to the 2 toys. Other babies looked like they were really struggling. They kept looking back and forth between the 2 options. And other babies seemed like they had stranger anxiety, like they were just sort of trying to avoid the situation and saying, this is a stranger. So we thought this was the most powerful comparison, because both of these infants have responded, so they don't have stranger anxiety, and both of them have understood something about the task because they're giving a toy over to the experimenter. And what differs between the 2 groups is which toy they're giving over. Are they sharing generously or are they sharing selfishly? So what I want to do now, and sorry, I should mention there was one other important relation here. We also looked exclusively at babies who shared the preferred toy, and we timed how long it took them to share that toy. And there was a correlation between how quickly they shared the toy and their difference in looking to these 2 outcomes. So babies who shared very quickly had larger difference in looking to those 2 outcomes than babies who shared more slowly. Okay, so let's go back to here. And what I want to do now is I want to show you a couple of video clips of what a more generous sharer looks like and what a more selfish sharer looks like. You don't see the choice phase in this part of the study. You just see when the experimenter comes up and what the baby does. So you'll see the babies with both toys in their hands. The first baby you'll see is going to share their preferred toy, and she does so rather quickly. The second baby is more selfish in her sharing. When the experimenter asks for a toy, she first says no, and then she hands over the selfish toy.
Can I have one? Thank you.
So it happened very quickly, but you could see she quickly handed over the doctor, and that was the toy that she had chosen on the first part of the study during the choice phase. And now we'll look at a more selfish share.
Turn around.
Yeah, turn around. Okay.
Can I have one?
So that's a pretty good characterization of those two different groups. So by way of summary, what have we learned so far? In terms of our questions about development, it seems that between about 12 and 15 months of age, at least in terms of the things, the particulars of what we were looking at, sensitivity to equality norms, generous sharing, you see some developmental changes. And critically, performance across these tasks are interrelated. So there seems to be a relation between infants' ability to detect a sociomoral norm and their ability to act prosocially, or in this case, share generously. With respect to the question of individual differences, we found evidence that they are present, certainly at 15 months of age, also 12 months of age, in terms of individual variability in performance. And as I just mentioned, that variability is related across the two tasks. An important question, I think, here has to do with stability. So when infants come back, will they look the same? Or will they look different? And then this is a question that we still want to get at that we haven't answered as of yet, is what about the origins of developmental change and individual differences, and whether parental values, beliefs, and attitudes are potentially the source of those. So just to catch you up to speed with where we are in our grant activities, we conducted the initial study that I told you about in the fall. Then we brought in a separate group of 12 and 15-month-olds this past winter. And the reason we wanted to have a separate group is because we wanted to do an independent replication of the findings that I've just told you about. Those kids are going to come back in the fall. They'll be 9 months older, so 21 and 24 months of age. We'll do tasks similar to ones that I've told you about, but a broader kind of battery, looking at their detection and evaluation of equality norms. So not only do they take toys away from unfair people, but do they reward fair people by giving them toys, for example. We want to look at prosocial behavior more broadly, sharing and also helping behaviors. Parents are filling out a battery of questionnaires that look at potential individual differences in empathy and prosociality and egalitarian attitudes. And then finally, because we think that there's some reason to believe that what might be mediating the relation across these two different types of tasks might have to do with individual differences in empathy. So we're trying to develop implicit and explicit measures of empathy that we can give to kids. So I think I'll end there and take questions. Thank you.
That was fascinating. Thank you. So I wanted to, could you describe a little bit more the control for the looking time experiment?
Yeah, good question. So we've actually run a bunch of different controls, so I'll tell you about the range of controls that we've run. One of the first controls that we ran was just the outcomes, devoid of any sort of social context. So all infants saw in terms of the outcomes was the crackers on the plates. We just wanted to be able to rule out the really simple sort of perceptual alternate interpretation. Infants look equally at both. In the study that we ran this past winter, we thought, well, we want to come up with a control condition that's a bit more closely matched to the experimental condition. So what we did there is everything was exactly the same in terms of the distribution, with one important exception. Instead of having people sitting in the chairs, we had pillows. And in fact, the pillows had pillowcases on that were the same color as the t-shirts that the people were wearing. So we really closely perceptually matched it. And then during the test trials, the distributor is there and also the pillows are there. So the real difference there is that either the recipients are real animate people or they're pillows who, of course, can't really be recipients. In that case, you get the same finding of equivalent attention to the control outcomes, longer looking to the unequal outcome for the experimental. Yeah.
So that was one variation of that I was imagining.
Yeah.
Here's another one that I was imagining. Have the actual distribution be done by something mechanical, non-personal, and have the people actually sitting in the chairs. And I wonder if the infants looking time difference is still there when they view the source of the distribution as a non-agent.
Right. And the other thing that we've thought about related to that is manipulating whether the distribution was intentional or accidental. So if someone isn't looking and they just spill some crackers onto a plate and spill some crackers onto it, but they don't know about it, will infants do it? I think certainly the older kids will get it because they're good at kind of the agent-non-agent distinction and the accidental-intentional one, but it remains to be seen empirically. Yeah.
I have a question for us, not developmental psychologist, about the key differences between 12 months and 15 months.
Yeah.
It's fascinating, very striking, just that 3-month time period. So is it like theory of mind, like one of the other perspectives spoke about,
Yeah.
or do you have intuition?
I think it's a really good question. So one of the things we're really interested in is the role that sharing games might play in development and individual differences, because it's at about that time that sharing games increase in their frequency and kids start taking part in more triadic versus dyadic interactions. So I think that might be a really important driver that's leading to that development. So that would be my first guess right now. We're also trying other variants of the paradigm just to make sure that it isn't something about the paradigm that it is a true age-related change that we're seeing, and it isn't something about the difficulty of the paradigm that is causing infants at 12 months not to show the effect.
So did you choose those ages then based on other research that you knew that was critical?
We chose the 15-month-olds because typically you see an increase in prosocial behavior between 14 and 18 months of age. So we thought that if we were trying to get the earliest emergence, that 15-month-olds would probably be successful. And we were less certain about 12-month-olds, but we thought it less likely that they would be successful. Yeah.
Thanks for that discussion. I have a question related back to the first one. I was totally trying to get a sense of if the controls you did already answer this question, which is that the unequal distribution of the yellow ducks and whatever, fish and octopus. I can see that being an aesthetic choice, not a moral choice from the kids. Like there's just more there than there are here, versus you seem to be implying that it's a punishment to the person who unfairly distributed. And I'm curious if you have a control for that. And similarly, on the second experiment, I'm giving you the toy. When I saw was the child giving the toy that they just tactilely maybe were paying more attention to at the time because it was in their mouth or was here in their hand versus here in their hand. And maybe it's an issue of they can only focus on one, and each happen to be focusing on, I don't know, a different one for a different reason. It's not really about how many things you might favor. It's just like, oh, a toy? Okay, I have this toy. Okay, you can have it. You can't have it.
Yeah, I think in terms of the latter one, I don't think that's the case, and I think that it's not the case because of the nice tight hookup with their looking times. So then you would have to come up with some sort of a story of why infants who were more likely to hand over the toy that they were more interested in would show that differential attention.
But the looking time would still be tied to aesthetics, right? Like I'm just more interested in why there were 3 there and 1 there.
I don't think so, because the infants who show that enhanced attention to the unfair outcome versus the fair outcome in control trials don't show that effect. So it's not just, so because we tested infants on both the experimental and control trials, we can compare them. So it's not that they generally look longer at the unequal amounts, it's that they specifically look longer in the social context condition, but don't in the non-social context. With respect to your first question, I think it's an important question, and I think we don't exactly know what's driving the effect there. As I said earlier, we had just sort of a pragmatic constraint. So now the way we're running the study is to have 2 recipients and a single distributor, so we don't conflate the amount with who's fair and who's unfair. But more broadly, I think that to very firmly draw those kinds of conclusions, we need tasks where infants will go in both directions, meaning that they will take, for example, toys away from the unfair person and give to the fair person to make sure it isn't just something about they pay more attention to one versus the other, right? And that then influence their choices. So we're going to look at a broader battery to see whether infants systematically vary their behavior in directions you would expect as a function of whether the person was fair or unfair.
I'm thinking about the results of the study too, where the infants are, I guess, punishing the person. And I'm wondering sort of about what you think is the underlying mechanism here in all of this. And looking at study 1 and 2, I'm sort of wondering about and maybe this is how it gets built, but sort of basic attentional kinds of mechanisms. So study 1 would suggest infants are preferentially attending to the unfair person in study 2. And then when you give them this sort of confusing choice where there's information right in front of them, one explanation is they're already preferentially attending to the one person, so that's the one they reach for to take the thing from. And it's not because they have some notion of fairness and now I'm going to enforce that norm. It's just under this stressful choice, I'm going to go with my dominant response, which is where my attention is already oriented. Now that might be the way that you sort of build up to these more abstract notions of fairness, but I'm sort of curious whether that's a sufficient explanation or if you think there's more to it there than that.
Yeah, so just to kind of clarify a little bit. So just so people know, the looking time task and the behavioral task are two separate tasks.
Yeah, I'm
And
just
although-
assuming that what's going on in study one would also be going on.
Right, but I think the difference is that in the looking time task, we're timing their attention to the outcomes, and they preferentially attend longer to the unfair outcome. In the active behavioral task, it's an ongoing task, and it's sort of, they see everything that you see. So just in terms of the online coding of infants' attention, there isn't any evidence as they watch these displays kind of play out, as opposed to as being presented with the outcome, that they attend more to one than the other. Now, you could say...
You measure how long they attend after one person takes one for themselves and...
Yes, right. We measure their attention to the two actors during that phase, right, which is an important thing. And they seem to attend equally to both of them. Now, you could still, it's a gross measure of attention, so maybe one could argue maybe there are attentional differences that we don't capture. So that's why, to sort of go back to the prior point, I think it is important to see that behavior will go both ways, because if we were to find, for example, that infants selectively take a toy from the unfair person and give a toy to the fair person, that would suggest that it couldn't just be about attention, because who they interact with depends on what they're doing. So I think that's an important follow-up to really be able to confidently say it's definitely not intentional.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's really fascinating, and I hope to see all the videos on YouTube.
You need a password, so
Oh, really? Okay, so yeah, I have to do it. But I was like thinking about your outcome measure, the looking time, because maybe I'm wrong, maybe I remember it wrong, but wasn't it like that the time a baby adapts to something unexpected is also a very good predictor of how intelligent the kid is, or it will be later, like the kids would adapt quicker, right? Who doesn't look like, or who doesn't stare at the unexpected.
Yeah, the finding you're talking about is a little bit different. So people have looked at information processing in the context of habituation paradigms and how that links up with higher IQ. But what they're looking at as the dependent measure is not how long babies stare at an unexpected outcome, but rather how long it takes them to habituate to a repeated stimulus that is typically an everyday repeated stimulus. So for example, a red toy car. So babies who, not within a single trial, but on repeated trials.
So on the repeating, so it's not about that, because otherwise it would mean that the clever kids like keep their preferred.
Right.
Okay.
Right, exactly. So I don't think it's about that, because that's a different finding. That's more about how quickly do they decrease attention to a familiar stimulus with repeated trials that links up with later IQ. Yeah.
I like that explanation much better.
Yeah.
So I found your findings about individual differences really striking, and I'm really curious about how those differences might play out in the long run. So I'm reminded, for example, of some of the findings in clinical psychology literature about how children who have an exaggerated startle reflex as babies are more likely to become shy kids, who are then more likely to become socially anxious teenagers and adults. So I'm very curious about how long you think you might be able to follow these infants, and what sorts of hypotheses you would have, if you were able to follow them in the long term. How you think that this might really play out, or be seen or not seen as they grow older.
Well, with continued funding, indefinitely. Yeah, I think, so we're going to bring them back 9 months later, and I think that there will, if I had to guess, I would think that there will be stability across time, which would be actually consistent with not only the clinical findings, but certainly in the developmental social cognition literature. The early tests of social cognition using looking time paradigms like this and some of the more active paradigms seem to be predicting individual differences in more kind of advanced theory of mind-like abilities all the way into the preschool and early school years. So I wouldn't be surprised if we were able to pick up on individual differences that far out. Of course, I think the nature of the tasks that we need to use are going to change, because they'll have to become more complex as kids' abilities become complex. But I think it's reasonable to expect at least that degree of stability.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. So, just bring it back.
So this is a question about the take a toy task, the choose phase. So maybe this doesn't even come up for infants at this stage, but was there a way to control for right-handedness and left-handedness?
Yeah, we asked them about parental reports of handedness, and it doesn't seem to have an effect on any of the tasks. Now, there's controversy about how early you can assess handedness. Some people think you can assess it before the first year of life, and other people think that you can't assess it until like 2 or 3. So we do ask them, and that doesn't seem to make a difference. And of course, we do things like counterbalance the location of the actors. So you would expect, for example, if babies are predominantly right-handed, they'd always go to the right. That doesn't appear to be the case. Yeah.
Okay, I think we're going to allow one more. So if anyone's got one last burning question.
Well, first, just to comment, when I was watching the 2 team members push the toys forward, all I could think of was the movie The Shining. I was wondering if they could watch that beforehand. This might just be repeating some comments or aspects of comments that other people have made, but it seems to be one thing to note a violation to note they're noting a violation of expectations.
Right.
And another thing for them to notice it under the sort of construal as a violation of fairness.
Right.
Which would seem to be an important sort of issue to parse out.
Right. Right, and I think that's the motivation. Well, first of all, it's the motivation behind at a baseline behind control trials, right? So you want to make sure it's not some sort of aesthetic preference or something like that. That it depends on the social context. That it depends on recipients being agents. But then I think also the more active tasks, where you have behavior that should be in line with getting the sort of the should component of things as opposed to the is component of things, right? And I also think it's an interesting question conceptually, because those 2 things needn't travel together. It could be the case that kids start off by just detecting the regularities, right? And then through some other mechanism, then start to assign meaning to them. In our case, it looks like, at least from the data that we've collected so far, there seems to be some consistency in ages across tasks. But of course, that doesn't mean that there'll be consistency when we use a larger battery. And it didn't have to be that way. So I think that's right. It is an important distinction between detecting the regularity, right, and then going one step further and saying that's a violation of a particular norm, and we're trying to get at both of those pieces. Yeah.